Okay, the next chapter that we're going to read is called A Cruel Sentence. A Cruel Sentence. Here we go. September was gone. It was the 1st of October when Mr. Reed recorded in his book that the Graves family had lost a fine mare to the Indians. They laughed at me when I had to leave Billy behind. Now I guess they're sorry, thought Virginia. The little black book her father was keeping comforted her when dark thoughts crowded in. While a record of the trip was being kept, she could tell herself that her fears were foolish. They would eventually reach California. She missed the palace wagon and the big oxen that used to pull even more than she missed Billy. She missed the Donners and wondered how far ahead they were. She missed all of her friends back in Illinois. She even missed school. Milt was supposed to be helping Mr. Reed keep his book. He had written in his full name, Mulford Elliott, on the flyleaf under Hiram Miller's name. In the back of the book was a pocket where some of his papers were kept. He didn't write much in it. Virginia liked writing better than Milt did. They laughed together at some of the things that were written. The men called the road they were following along Mary's River a perfect snake trail. That seemed so funny to Virginia that she told Patty about it, little dreaming that they would read the same book years later with tears in their eyes. On Sunday, October 4th, it ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. A quarrel ended it. "Oh, Patty, I wish the teamsters wouldn't quarrel so," Virginia said to her little sister the next day when they were arguing about doubling up teams to pull the wagons over an especially long hill. They had passed a place they called Gravelly Ford, but this was another just such hill with rocks and gravel making it a difficult pull for the oxen. Everyone was out walking to lighten the loads in the wagons. 2 of the Graves wagons had already been pulled over by doubling up teams. John Snyder, driving the third, declared his oxen could make it alone. "I don't need any help from your team, Milt Elliott," he called back as he lay the bulwark over the oxen. So usually if you were somebody that was a teamster that you were driving oxen, you would use your whip and you would whip right above the top of the ox's head, right? So you wouldn't actually make contact with the whip. You would just whip near the ox's head so that the oxen would pull harder, right? So you weren't really hitting the oxen, but John Snyder is a teamster that believes in actually hitting the oxen. And you're going to see the end of a whip is really small and has a little piece of leather, like a square piece of leather on the end. He turns the whip around and starts using the handle of the whip. He's holding on to the little part and he's using the handle to actually hit the oxen. And that really bothers people because that isn't how you use a whip. And also, that's not going to motivate the oxen to pull harder. You're actually just abusing them, right? And so he starts really whacking the oxen hard, and it bothers everybody. It especially bothers the other teamsters because they don't believe in that. "I don't need any help from your team, Milt Elliott," he called back as he lay the bulwark over his oxen. "If you don't want my help, you'll have to let me pass," Milt retorted. "You're slowing up the whole line of wagons." At that, Snyder became furious and yelled out that it was Milt who had slowed them up. He struck his oxen with the butt end of his whip, shouting and swearing at them to pull. Milt was determined to pass. It was a dangerous thing to try on the narrow trail. There was more shouting and swearing as the men quarreled. "What's the matter with them? I never saw them act so. Can't we do something, Mama?" asked Patty. "I'll speak to Milt. You mind Tommy." Leaving the children, she hurried up the hill to make peace if she could. Other mothers were struggling along, carrying their babies. Patty had her doll in her arms, and Jimmy was cracking a little whip in imitation of the teamsters. Virginia hoped he never imitated what they were saying. "Their wheels are tangled, I think. Oh, oh," she cried as Snyder let his whip fall again. "Here comes Pa. He'll stop them," yelled Jimmy. Mr. Reed had been out hunting. He rode up and tried to make the men listen to reason. Milt pulled back, but John Snyder seemed to have lost all control of his temper. Maybe you'd like beating. Maybe you'd like a beating instead of the oxen, he snarled at the children's father. No one could talk to him like that and get away with it. More angry words followed. Finally, Mr. Reed said, "We'll settle this, John, when we get up the hill." "No," replied Snyder with an oath. "We will settle it now." Springing on the tongue of the wagon. So a wagon has a thing that looks like a cross on the front of it. So a covered wagon had a hole in the top, or had a hole in the front, right? It has the cover over the top, and then it has a box. And coming down from the box of the wagon, it was a thing called a tongue. And the tongue was a long pole that had a little cross on the end. And the cross is what the oxen were hooked up to. The oxen were wearing a yoke, and a yoke held one ox next to the other ox so that they wouldn't pull unequally. And the tongue with the little cross on the end was how the oxen were hooked up to the wagon so that they could pull together and pull the wagon. So he jumps down on the tongue of the wagon, and I think they called it a tongue because a covered wagon has an opening that kind of looks like a mouth. It's black where you see inside the wagon. It looks like an open mouth, and then the wooden pole that attaches to the oxen comes down. So he jumps down on the tongue of the wagon. He struck out with his whip, using the heavy butt end of it. One blow followed another. It happened so fast Virginia could only remember the screams and the blood streaming from the gash on her father's head, and her mother running between them. So John Snyder starts whipping and beating on Virginia's dad, on Mr. Reed. And then Mrs. Reed steps in to make him stop, and he whips Mrs. Reed. And there's kind of a rule of thumb. It's still a rule today that you don't hit women. Men don't hit women. It's not okay to hit a woman. And so he accidentally whips Mrs. Reed, and that makes everyone furious, right? They're furious that he's whipping the oxen, but then he hits Mr. Reed, and everyone's like, well, that's just a fight. But then he accidentally hits Mrs. Reed, whips her, and everyone gets furious about that. It happened so fast Virginia could only remember the screams and the blood streaming from a gash in her father's head, and her mother running between them. She saw the uplifted whip and heard her father cry, "John, John!" She saw him draw his hunting knife from its sheath, and then down came the whip across her mother's head and shoulders. Virginia began to run towards her, with Patty and the little boys following. It was only a second afterwards that John Snyder fell. Uncle Billy Graves was there to catch him. He and some of the others carried him up on the hill, where a crowd quickly gathered around. Patrick Breen ran up, and a gasp was heard. "Uncle Patrick, I'm dead." "You aren't, John. You can't be." Mary Graves bent over him, calling his name, but there was no answer. Someone said, "It was my fault." Virginia never knew whether it was the dying John Snyder or Milt Elliott who blamed himself for the tragedy. Mr. Reed dashed the blood from his eyes and offered to help, but was turned away by Keysburg. "He hates you, Papa," Virginia said afterwards. Mr. Reed had been so sorry for his act that he had thrown away his hunting knife. "I like John Snyder, in spite of his fiery temper. I never meant to do it," he said. "Daughter, do you think that you can dress these wounds in my head? Your mother is not able, and they must be attended to." "I'll try," Virginia said, "if you will tell me what to do." Following his instructions, she brought a basin of water and went into the wagon, where she dressed his wounds as well as she could, and then burst out crying. "I shouldn't have asked so much of you," he said humbly. "Oh, Papa," Virginia cried, It's pity for you that makes me cry. They say out there that you killed him, but he ran against your knife. I know you were only trying to keep him from hurting Mama. But they hate us. They call us aristocrats because we started out like rich people. Now we have nothing, but I don't care anymore. It's you and Mama and Patty and the little boys I care for." I know. But they hate us," Virginia repeated. They won't understand, especially Mary Graves. She and John Snyder were going to be married, I think. All the girls were saying it. And now, fresh sobs kept her from finishing. She had started to say, and now there will be another funeral instead of a wedding. But her father felt badly enough without any reminder of the worst things that were to come. After the services conducted by Patrick Breen with loud praying and louder accusations, an angry knot of people gathered for a conference from which the Reed family was excluded. They waited in terrified silence a little way down the hill. Mrs. Reed, still dazed and shocked by all that had happened, lay on a cot inside the tent with Patty and the boys hovering over her. Even the little dog Cash tried to show his sympathy. If the Donners hadn't gone ahead, they'd help us, Patty kept saying. Eliza and her brother Bayless had joined the conference. Were they for or against her father? Virginia did not know. She waited beside him in terrified silence to learn the outcome of it. Many voices cried out against him, Keseberg's louder than the others. His German accent was no longer funny as he called for a hanging and raised his wagon tongue like a cross at the top of the hill, because they would use the wagon tongue to hang him, hook a noose onto the tongue, and it would hang him. It's murder, the Breens agreed in their Irish brogue. He should hang for it. The Bible says thou shalt not kill, the widow Murphy said piously. But Ma, won't we be killing him? Asked Simon, her youngest son. He should be killed. We do it. How many say ja? Keseberg had stirred them to such anger that nearly everyone in the company shouted out in agreement with him. Virginia tried to hold him back, but her father was determined to go out there and get the punishment over with as quickly as possible. Walking toward the angry mob in his usual dignified way, he bared his neck to the rope they were dragging up the hill and said quietly, "Come on, gentlemen." But no one moved. So here's what it looks like. Oops. So here she is with her father, and the wagon tongue looks like a cross that they're going to hang him from. After a short silence, a few mutterings began to be heard from the Graves and the Murphy families, and then Mr. Eddy spoke up, and his voice rang clear. He did it in self-defense. He killed, didn't he? John Snyder's dead. A life for a life, young Billy Graves insisted. He and his sister Mary did not think it was self-defense. They described what had happened, and it all sounded different, as if Mr. Reed had done it on purpose. Virginia could hardly believe anyone could say such terrible things of her own dear papa, who was the kindest, most generous man in the world. They were making a saint out of Snyder, but Milt Elliott wouldn't stand for it. "Have you forgotten?" he began, but was interrupted before he could finish. They had not forgotten that it was Milt who started the fight. He was told he ought to be hanging on the wagon tongue along with Reed. Mrs. Eddy spoke up. "Have you men lost your senses?" Calmer counsel soon prevailed. So that's somebody who said just the right thing at the right time. Like, instead of being a bystander and just watching all of this craziness happen, she actually says, "Have you all lost your minds?" And it causes all of them to stop for a second and think, yeah, maybe we have lost our minds. Calmer counsel soon prevailed. The Breens and the Murphys quieted down, and the Graves family explained that they only wanted to see justice done. "Is it justice to hang a man without a fair trial?" shouted Eddy. "He should be banished then." Virginia, listening, thought that it was Patrick Dolan who made this suggestion. Now all the Breens agreed. He would be banished without food and without his gun. So if you were living in the woods and you didn't have any food and you didn't have a gun, you would have there aren't grocery stores. They're up in the mountains. There's nothing up there. And also, it's starting to snow, and so there aren't a lot of animals around. But if he has a gun, at least if he sees an animal, he can shoot it and he can hunt and get a little bit of meat to eat. There aren't a lot of plants to eat up there, and so if he doesn't have a gun, he's going to starve to death. And if they don't give him any food to take with him, he's going to starve to death. And if he doesn't have a horse, it's going to take him forever on foot to get up over the mountains, and so he will probably die. So, in other words, instead of killing him by hanging, banishing him means we're just going to kill you. It's just going to take longer. Right? This amounted to a death sentence, which that's like what I'm saying. It's if you send somebody out without food or a gun in the 1800s, in the woods, in the mountains, that's a death sentence. A man unprotected in the wilderness would soon starve or be killed. They spoke of this, and someone said, "Let his blood be on their heads, not ours." "We banish him," screamed Keseberg. "We send him off to die." Reed had threatened him with banishment. Now the tables were turned. Mrs. Keseberg, who had been saved from a beating by the threat, stood there holding her baby, not saying a word. The Wolfingers spoke to her in German, and then a cry went up, "Banish him! Banish him!" "Is it agreed?" asked Mr. Graves, and all the hands were raised. Sentence was passed. Mr. Reed heard it with a bowed head. He was given time to say goodbye to his family. Then he must leave. An exile from the wagon train. Even his horse was at first denied him, but Eddie led it around to the Reed camp afterwards and said, "Take it. You may catch up with the Donners if you ride fast. They are your friends." All right, so we will stop right there. So now Mr. Reed, now his family has to travel all by themselves, and Mr. Reed has no gun. He does have a horse though, but he has no food and no gun, and they're sending him out away from everyone else. The irony is that because he was able to get out, he was able to rescue everyone. So he was able to save everyone's lives, which is kind of interesting since they were screaming about taking his life, right? You'll see that as the story goes on. All right, thanks for joining me.